The March 1st movement. Korea leads the way in the era of self-determination. A presentation to the Korean Society of Maryland. My name is Daniel Whalen. I traveled to Seoul, South Korea as a delegate to the 7th International Conference on Geographic Naming and Education in July of 2016. In December 2016, at the George Washington University, I presented a paper entitled Dixie and the East Sea, Using Communities in Controversy over Confederate and First Peoples Place Names to Discover and Compare Aspects of Nationalism at Work in the East Sea Naming Dispute, for the Korean Studies Institute. I currently teach Homeland Security Science and GIS Digital Cartography at Parkdale High School in Prince George's County, Maryland. Korea has a rich history of interaction and influence with both China and Japan. Korea evolved independently, while moving through the cultural orbit of these neighbors that more directly contended with the influences of European powers, both of which were roiled by epochs of isolation and coerced interaction. After about a quarter century of trade and reform with the United States and other European powers, Japan rapidly modernized its economy and military. Japan began to imperialize neighboring countries. Starting with the Treaty of Ganghwa of 1876, the influence of China in Korean affairs began to wane, and that of Japan began to rise. According to Kiam-Moon Hwang, professor of history and East Asian languages and culture, Japanese imperial administration gradually bought the loyalty of Korea's elites and promoted socially low Koreans to posts of imperial administration. By 1910, although Emperor Goyong attempted to resist the Japanese occupation by sending an envoy to The Hague in 1907, ultimately he was deposed. The emperor remained alive as a figurehead of government until his death, January 21st, 1919. The emperor's passing, which was widely blamed on Japanese officials, would serve as a catalyst for the March 1st movement. The fifth point of American President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points aimed to settle disputes of sovereignty in the defeated Central Powers' former imperial holdings in Europe and abroad. The endorsement of self-determination for colonized peoples was heard around the world and led nations to demand liberation. Korea was no exception. In fact, the March 1st movement would provide an example for other contemporaneous movements such as the Egyptian Revolution of 1919, which started in April, the anti-Japanese, anti-warlord May 4th movement in China, and soon thereafter India's non-cooperation movement formed in 1920. In February 1919, the Korean Youth Independence Corps in Tokyo had already drafted a manifesto of Korean independence. Activists around Korea were planning mobilization for large-scale protests against Japanese rule. An opportune moment formed as a large-scale assembly of cultural, religious, and political leaders began to arrive in Seoul to mourn the passing of Emperor Goyong. The official declaration was penned by historian Nam-Seon and signed by 33 important leaders. The document was signed in a restaurant out of public view, delivered to the Japanese Governor General, and was followed immediately by simultaneous readings around Korea, while these leaders boldly turned themselves in to the authorities. An energized Korean populace began to demonstrate and march all around Korea, openly challenging Japanese oppression with nonviolent protest. Three notable leaders illustrate the breadth of this popular movement: the preacher Yam, the laureate Nam-Seon, and the elite expatriate Syngman Rhee. Reverend leader Yam began preparing clergy for organizing demonstrations throughout the 1910s. Uyam influenced congregations to make sustained prayer for independence and would be one of the 33 signers of the Korean Declaration of Independence. Publisher and historian Cho Nam-Seon authored the Declaration of Independence. As a well-educated and prolific literary and informational voice in Korea, his writing was widely known and respected among Koreans. Cho Nam-Seon was jailed for his contribution to the March 1st movement, and ironically, would later be jailed temporarily in 1950 for perceived collaboration with the Japanese. Cho Nam-Seon may be as influential as Thomas Jefferson in his era for the promotion of self-determination among imperialized people. Dr. Syngman Rhee was born in Korea but was later forced to flee to the United States in 1905 after imprisonment and release. Rhee earned degrees at the George Washington University, Harvard, and Princeton, and aided envoys in negotiating with the United States government. His lifetime of advocacy would see him thrust home into Korean politics at the end of the Second World War, after holding and losing ministerships in different Korean governments in exile. While political independence was not won by the March 1st movement, several changes did begin to occur, according to Kyung-Moon Hwang. The disquieted Japanese colonial administration turned from strict military rule to cultural rule, allowing and encouraging exhibitions of Korean culture, also curbing their press censorship. A noticeable increase in religious, cultural, and political associations resulted. Koreans migrated increasingly from the countryside to cities, and traditional social hierarchies were challenged. This would last until the reactionary policies were enacted in Korea in the midst of the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937. According to Cho Lee-Yuao's article in the South Korean Feminist Journal, Korean society, in which the virtues demanded of daughters were essentially chastity and obedience, saw schoolgirls planning and directing mass demonstrations and organizing secret society meetings. The March 1st movement has great significance in the history of Korean women's movements. Japan's initial reaction was that of brutal repression. One estimate marks 7,500 deaths and 46,000 arrests in response to the demonstrations and boycotts between March and July of 1919. But when this crackdown abated, Koreans had taken back some of the power Imperial Japan had appropriated from civil and private life. Professor Kyung-Moon Hwang's research in the U.S. Department of State discovered that the consulate in Seoul was directed by the State Department that it should be extremely careful not to encourage any belief that the United States would assist Korean nationalists in carrying out their plans, and that it should not do anything which may cause Japanese authorities to suspect the American government sympathizes with the Korean nationalist movement. Even though the United States was not ready to engage Korea as an ally at that time, we have a strong alliance today. Koreans and Americans should remember the March 1st movement because it reminds us of our shared history and throwing off imperial rule.